Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christianson. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kushaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
Hey, Dr. C here with you. This is going to be a really fun episode. This was a talk I had with Melanie Avalon. She's a really good friend and a renowned actress. She's an author of a book, What, When, Wine. She's got a great podcast going, a couple of them actually, and a certified holistic nutritionist. So Melanie's just a bright, inquisitive person who's been in this health space for quite some time and sorting out her own health first and then helping to others come to a better understanding. And she and I had a great talk. The general idea was sharing with you all publicly some of the discussions we had back and forth about intermittent fasting and my views about what we know in medical research and her perspectives about real-world applications. So we had a great coming to understanding over many emails, and we had some fun tangents on this one too, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So, all right, welcome to the episode and enjoy the time with Melanie Avalon. Hey, Dr. C here with you. Welcome back to another episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. So, super jazzed to be joined with my friend Melanie Avalon. So, Melanie, how you doing today?
Doing really well. How about you, Alan?
I'm doing great. Really good. Thank you. Good to be with you here.
I know. This is really good. I guess we've talked a lot via email, a few times on the phone, but this will be our first extensive conversation. I'm pretty excited.
Extensive conversation. That's awesome.
Yes.
You know, it's a cool thing too, because something that I'm really trying to figure out right now, I think that a lot of the big questions we have answered, but the struggle is oftentimes getting past ideas and getting past entrenched belief systems. And I see no way around the idea of engaging people who see things differently than we do. And it's a tricky thing. And I just want to give you such a big shout out, because we were going to do a podcast a while back. There was something that I had stated, a post that I had about intermittent fasting, which was a big part of your platform before. And I was sharing some critical research on that. And someone else who was a partner of yours questioned whether it makes sense to have me visible when I was saying things that were contrary to what you guys thought. And so we had just a lovely discussion back and forth for quite a while about that.
Yeah, it was such a unique beginning to our friendship, but I think it worked out for the best. So I'm still the co-host of the Intermittent Fasting podcast, so that is a really large part of my platform. And yeah, it was a interesting time. Alan reached out to us about being on the podcast, and I would love to have you on. I love, engaging with different ideas. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about intermittent fasting in this interview.
Oh yeah.
I think what I know is that I know nothing. So, I'm always looking to question things and see what we know, what we don't know. But at that time, it just wasn't the right fit with all the parties involved. But from there, I think we had some great discussions. So now I'm happy that we can finally talk it out some more.
Yeah, and thank you again for your patience with me, and you're willing to persist. And I think a lot that, I don't know, my better self, or the self that I want to keep moving into, is one that puts the most weight into trying to get it right and doesn't really worry about being right. So thank you for helping me in that evolution.
Oh, same here. It's very mutual.
And a funny thing is, I think a hang up that I had, or something that I was not seeing, was I was thinking a lot about the question of whether or not things like fasting, intermittent fasting, whether they're simply superior to other methods of just lowering food intake, whether they work better in controlled settings. And I think I was ignoring the fact that there may be some real world applications in which, maybe in a perfect scenario, it's less clear, but maybe for some people and some responses, they could be better approaches. So that's kind of the theme I wanted to talk through. But yeah, kicking it off, I would love for you to help just kind of define some of these terms that get thrown about. We've got things like intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding, alternate day fasting, caloric restriction, fasting, and maybe some I haven't thought of. But yeah, can you give us a good lay of the land, please?
We are so on the same page. That was literally my first bullet point, was discussing how there are so many different approaches and terminology and concepts of intermittent fasting. And I think right off the bat, that's one of, not the problems, but one of the issues that arises in discussing it, because there are so many different ways that it manifests, and that probably has different implications in the effects that it has on the body and the health effects.
Sure.
So I think, intermittent fasting is becoming obviously increasingly more and more popular. When I first got into it, like a decade ago, people, if you mentioned it, nobody had really heard of it. Now I can pretty much say it and in public, and people typically sort of know what it is, or even might say that they've tried it. But there are different ways that it manifests. So typically people consider intermittent fasting in a broad sense, not eating constantly throughout the day. So eating in some sort of time window. The ways that often manifests is often like an 18-6 pattern. That's one of the more popular patterns. 16-8. So that's where you go 16 hours straight without eating, and then an 8-hour eating window. And then you can titrate it down accordingly. Some people do a 1 meal a day type pattern. That's where you eat quote, 1 meal. So you may or may not measure that on the clock. But then there's the whole thing that some people don't even consider what I just discussed, intermittent fasting. In the clinical literature, they might call it time restricted eating, TRE, or time restricted feeding, TRF. Some people don't consider intermittent fasting unless you are fasting more hours than that. Some other popular approaches or ways that it's looked at is ADF. So that's alternate day fasting. So that, again, manifests different ways, but typically that's where people go about 36 hours without eating. And then they have a normal day. And then that might happen one or two times per week. That also gets a little bit iffy, because some approaches will actually allow a reduced calorie intake during the fast. That can also manifest 5-2 is a pretty common one. That's where you have 2 days a week where you are either completely fasting or you're having this reduced calorie intake, which further complicates things further, because if you're saying, oh, it's a fasting day, but you can still have 500 calories, then in theory, depending on what those calories are, that could look like, a pretty normal, depending on what you're eating, it could possibly, mess with things on the clinical literature and the scientific or the biological markers, depending on what you're eating. So yeah, I mean, that was a lot, but basically I think one of the problems is, what is intermittent fasting and what do we call it and what does it look like? So yeah.
And I think there are some more so weaker versions of these ideas, straw man versions of an argument that argue against the law of thermodynamics and argue that as long as you have certain timing, that the food quantities don't matter, and that's not really borne out. So they're both factors seem to be relevant.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other things I've written down, that I think oftentimes people think that intermittent fasting is like a get out of jail free card, or that as long as they're fasting a certain amount of hours, it literally does not matter how much they consume in the eating window, that it'll just magically all be dealt with in the fast. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Yeah, people will like to say, it really, really doesn't matter, but I think it does matter. One of the things I'm really fascinated with, and we've talked about briefly, and I've heard you talk about a lot on your podcast, like some of the other episodes, is the concept of different macronutrients. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm just really, really fascinated by, for example, overconsumption of calories on extreme macros, like, extremely high carb, but if it's like zero fat, like the implications of that, compared to the same amount of calories on a mixed diet, the calories might be matched, but the amount of fat that can like be created by the body is likely going to be very different. So it's very interesting.
I'll just throw out some observations I've seen along those ways and welcome, your notes and any discussion on that. I have seen data arguing that when it's, so I think about fuel as, and you've read the work, my work, you understand this, but for some that may not have I think about fuel as like carbs or fats, somewhat interchangeable in this discussion. Ketones, exogenous could go in the group too. Protein seems to be a little bit different as far as its thermic effects and then the ability in terms of its impact upon satiety. But in terms of surely of thermodynamics, there seems to be a little difference between carbs and fats. But yeah, somehow at the extremes, if you can do diets that are pretty unusual to where your amounts of one of those is, almost gone, it seems to skew things a little bit to where there is almost a bit of a wasting effect that may be not the same as when they are mixed. So, yeah.
Yeah, we get this question all the time on the Intermittent Fasting podcast, which is, I'm doing intermittent fasting, I'm not losing weight, what should I do? And, my co-host will often say, just stick it out, keep going, like the fast will work. But I often like to suggest looking at what they're eating in the eating window. And like you said, going on, if people can find it palatable, I think you can do a lot of really interesting tweaks with your macronutrients that just set you up for having, if you're doing especially intermittent fasting, having a lot of satiety and feeling full, but just because of the macronutrients, not gaining as much weight from that, just from a purely like you said, like the thermodynamics of it all, which I already said it, but basically that usually pans out to be, high carb, low fat, or low carb, high fat. But once you like mix the macros together, I think it gets a little bit dangerous. So,
something I've observed, and this fits along this line, it's almost like so many approaches are just like rubrics that change that like the roundabout ways of eating less without, the idea of counting calories in controlled settings is pretty consistently effective, but in the real world, it's not the most effective approach for all people. It's just doesn't really work across the board. So there's often a lot of roundabout ways this happens. So some people might cut out certain foods that are thought to be common food sensitivities, like they're cutting out dairy, bread, sugar, egg products, peanuts, soy, whatever else. A lot of these things are calorically dense. So in many cases, they've lowered their food intake, or the average person on an unstructured diet may have half of their food intake from carbohydrates. So they go low carb, they've lowered their food intake a lot. Or, you cut your eating window and you end up lowering your food intake inadvertently. So I think in many cases, it may be roundabout ways to do this without having to, that might end up working better for given individuals. So yeah, your thoughts about like roundabout ways of just lowering food intake that are different.
Yeah. And I almost feel bad about it because I, like the spirit of me wants to say, we'll just be intuitive and eat intuitively. But I think, well, I'm still completely for that, but I think it's sort of hard, especially when you're not quite to the place of intuition, like when you are still run by, depending on your metabolism and what you've been eating and your insulin situation and how you respond to foods, things might seem very intuitive, especially since our bodies are, biologically, they want to store excess calories, for the long haul. And when we're surrounded by these hyper palatable foods 24/7, in a way, you could argue it is intuitive to eat all the foods all the time from our body's perspective. So, having these sort of, looking at it a different way. Okay, how can I actually eat nutritious foods? Because we could make these foods, be whole food choices. And like you said, address food sensitivities and things like that. But then as far as filling up, I think that macronutrient approach, even things like looking at the bulk, like I was just reading the other day that apparently the average person consumes 3 to 4 pounds of food a day, regardless of calories. So, except for, I guess, the carnivore people. But, if you think about that, then assuming people are okay with, bulk and fiber, it almost wants you to encourage people to make sure they are getting some sort of bulk in their diet. So there's so many factors involved.
Well, in the recent Hall study suggested that eating what you want, if it's all unprocessed food, it might be quite different than it's processed. But, here's just to be transparent and the end of one story. I've logged my food intake. Boy, I've had windows in which I've not, and I should have. I gained a lot of weight like right after medical school. And then also, boy, my last part of high school. And when I was very young, I was quite heavy, but I started paying attention to that and logging food in some way when I was about 12. And apart from those windows I just mentioned, I pretty much always have. And I've tried really hard. I've had stretches where I've tried to do the cognitive exercises of intuitive eating, and I found them helpful things. Any way to raise awareness and increase the focus on things is good. But my weight would just creep up, and totally unprocessed food. And the bizarre thing too is that I've done amateur athletics in various ways, and the more I train, the more my intuitions will lead me to gain weight. So if I don't exercise, it's actually easier. But when I'm training a lot, and I've seen data about, overfeeding cycles where someone trains more than 400 calories a day, they may overcompensate by several hundred, but I'm completely in that boat. So I'm one to where, I do still rely upon a rubric, and mine happens to be logging.
Yeah, I'm actually very, very similar in that way. And the more actually, I don't know if you're familiar at all with the work of Ray Peat. Have you heard much? Yeah.
I'm not in detail, but I'm loosely familiar with it.
Yeah. So his work, his work is all about boosting metabolism, and eating, eating a lot, with the exception of certain foods that he finds to be very, that they slow the metabolism. So specifically like polyunsaturated fatty acids. He includes omega-3s in that as well, which is really, really interesting. But so in that work, it's like you avoid PUFAs like the plague. And I know like for me personally, and I've been suggesting this actually to listeners, if you try cutting out polyunsaturated fats, especially like in the form of nuts and things like that, and I think it can have a really, really interesting effect, because it just seems that there are some substrates that are just more easily they just more easily encourage body fat. And like I know for me, this is an interesting, of course, again, an N of one experiment like you, but so I've had some GI issues, and so I've been like very low weights before. And at one point I was like, okay, how can I consume a massive amount of calories in an easily digestible form? So I tried doing basically like high doses of MCT oil, because that's supposed to be, really easy on the gut, go straight to the liver for fuel. So I would go like protein, super high MCT, easily digestible vegetables that I could handle. And I would go to the tune of, I'm not making this up, probably like 5,000 calories. And the effect of that was I just lost more weight. And I was like, okay, clearly there's something here with calories in, calories out, not being the whole picture.
Well, and specifically, MCTs, I've seen data on pharmacokinetics, and there's thresholds above which there's actually a lot of malabsorption that comes into place from them.
Yeah. So it seems like it's really, really fascinating. And even in, when I was doing research for my book, What, When, Why, and I was doing research on alcohol, because that has a really interesting connection to body weight gain. And I'm sure they couldn't do these studies anymore today, but I found some studies like from probably like the 70s or 80s, where they would overfeed hospital patients diets of pure alcohol.
Wow.
Yeah. Or I don't know, they might have had like something else as well, but they would give them basically like, thousands of calories extra in the form of alcohol, and they wouldn't gain any weight from it. And so I guess I feel like we're on a huge tangent here, but basically the point is that people put things in their mouth, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically going to, it doesn't define how it's used or processed by the body. So
I'm just thinking thousands of calories of alcohol, how many ounces? So it's like 30 calories an ounce. So 310, so 30 ounces. That's like 30 servings of alcohol. Wow.
I want to like pull up that study. I might be able to find it, but
That
yeah,
sounds...
it was a lot. It was a lot. I'm sure they couldn't do it today. I think it was actually a study in alcoholics.
Have you figured out any clues? I talked about some of those rubrics and some of those different methods people stumbled across, and any clues on if a person could know in advance? Because one thing that frustrates me is the idea that everyone's different. Everyone has to figure it out for themselves. And there's a there's a sentiment that's noble about respecting individual needs. But when you think it through, there's also something about that that's almost, I don't know, it's almost like abandonment. It's like, go do this. And if there's a whole point of being able to filter information or guide someone, it should be to give them some shortcuts and not to have to go try everything from start to finish for 6 months and move on to the next, because life isn't long enough for that. So yeah, any clues someone might think about in terms of if intermittent fasting in general, or if intermittent fasting as a subtype would be better than another path for someone, how would someone sort that out?
Yeah. So going back to the intermittent fasting side of things, I think if you haven't tried it, hands down, I think it's a great thing to try for a lot of reasons, not just the weight loss perspective, which we can discuss. And we can also discuss, are the benefits, is the weight loss just coming from calorie restriction, or is there something else, within the actual fast? But I think, honestly, one of the one of the best benefits from it is, at least in the beginning, is just losing or having the realization that you don't have to be eating 24/7. Because I think that's just such a paradigm shift in your mind, in a person's mind. And it's very freeing in a way. And it does, people think it'll take a lot of willpower, but once you get into the habit and once you've done it, it varies for people. Some people adapt right away. Some people it takes a few weeks. But once you get into the groove of it, most people find that their hunger hormones adapt appropriately, and they're only getting hungry now in their quote eating window. And it frees up so much willpower because you're not having to worry about making all these food choices during the day. So it's not like you're engaging 24/7 with, should I eat this? Should I not eat this? Should I count these calories? How many calories did I eat? How many do I have left? Which is a very, very draining way to go for a lot of people. So I think that alone has so much application to so many people. I mean, especially comparing it to calorie restriction, because so many times people will say, that the benefits of intermittent fasting are purely due to calorie restriction. And even if people aren't meaning to calorie restrict, that they accidentally calorie restrict, which I would actually see as a really great thing, because we know the benefits of calorie restriction, or we see them. We see that there are a lot of benefits to it, but it's often very, very hard for people to maintain. So if people are accidentally calorie restricting, I see that as like a pretty nice side effect.
That's what I was mentioning about that idea about those rubrics. If someone's inadvertently eating less, and that's a way that they end up doing so and falling into that, then so be it.
Yeah, exactly. So, we can talk a little bit more as well. Are the benefits of IF just due to calorie restriction? And from what I've done in the research, I really don't think they are. I think, and I'm glad we're having this conversation now, because when you and I were first talking about this, when was that? That was probably somewhere around a little more than a year ago, probably a year and a half ago, I would guess. Yeah. So when we were first talking, I feel like even since then, so much research has come out surrounding, genetics and sirtuins and fasting and, all of these different pathways. I recently, like David Sinclair's book, Lifespan, was just absolutely wonderful. And I had him on my other podcast, which was the Melanie Avalon biohacking podcast. And so I'm happy we're having this conversation now, because I think, at least for me, I've come to realize that there are so many other aspects involved, that it might not just be calorie restriction. Because I feel like, we like to think maybe it is just calorie restriction, when I think instead it might be that calorie restriction and fasting are both activating similar pathways in the body. So they're, affecting AMPK and mTOR, activating sirtuins. So having these effects, modulating insulin. So I think, I don't think that they're necessarily quite the same thing.
Yeah, certainly a lot more to learn. One thing, just brief aside, I thought that I've had about a lot of the ideas about life extension. I think about health span and lifespan, and we've got this idea of achieving what could be a genetic potential or going past that. And there's a lot of models that have come out from biomarkers, test tube studies, animal studies, probabilistic human studies that suggest various strategies might change one's longevity. And it'll be awesome if we actually learn something and have some good evidence at some point. But I don't know. I'm a little jaded about the enterprise because I think about health span. If we could get up to whatever our potential is, say that's, 100, 110, 120, and it might not be the same strategy that it would take to get past that potential. And it seems that some of the strategies that are pretty well documented in humans to help people overcome a lot of the problems of having a good health span, like sarcopenia, for example. I've seen a lot of robust evidence that a reasonable but higher than common protein intake may be protective against sarcopenia. And we've got good evidence that as people age, a positive thought about protein intake and encouraging it can offset their risks for fractures and frailty and immune complications, pneumonia, things along those lines. But then on the other side, there's arguments about saying if we restrict that, then maybe that'll help our longevity genes. And I could think that if most adults died like right after their 120th birthday, I could see where it would make a lot of sense. Just like, let's do whatever we can to get past this barrier. But it seems like that's not so much the barrier, and that most of us are not even achieving our health span. So yeah, I just wonder about some of those ideas.
Yeah, the protein concept is really fascinating and something that I've been, looking a lot into because there's this very, very strong camp saying, limit protein intake for longevity. But like you said,
and I understand it from the idea of like trying to extend lifespan, but it runs against all the things we know about health span.
Exactly. And then even like the whole debates of animal versus plant protein. And yeah, I mean, my personal thoughts, and maybe this is just because I've found that it works for me, and I'm all about people finding what works. It's funny. People often be like, Melanie, what do you do so I can do it? I'm like, no, you find what works for you. I'll just share the information of what I've read. But I think we're all so individual that we really do have to find what works for us individually. But for me, with the whole protein thing is I seem to benefit the most from minimizing, by my version of quote intermittent fasting, minimizing that intake of protein. And then, for an extended part of time during the day. So you're not activating mTOR, you're keeping your AMPK high. You're stimulating this lifespan, but then in your eating window, taking in ample protein to stimulate the anabolic phase, stimulate the mTOR, the recovery. And at least for me, I feel like that's the best of both worlds.
You feel like it's the best, meaning there's certain experiences in the short term you notice, or what do you mean that way?
It gives me the ability to take in ample protein, have adequate recovery, protect against muscle loss, all of these things, but not have to worry about the constant mTOR stimulation 24/7 with a protein intake all throughout the day.
So you're trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly. That's what I'm all about. Because I've tried experiments where I'll do, if I do like lower protein, just in general for a 24-hour cycle, I actually feel it. I feel it very immediately. Like I feel very weak. And I know they say that nitrogen, like your body's adaptation to nitrogen synthesis, or, the turnover rate of protein takes like 3 days. So maybe I would need to stick it out for like 3 days. But there's just something that doesn't feel right intuitively for me. So this is completely just N of one. But yeah, for me, I like my protein. So keeping it in a window seems to work really well for me.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. This is Dr. Raquel Espinal at Integrative Healthcare. So often we hear from our new patients that their primary care physician has told them that their thyroid and hormone levels are fine and they should not worry. Yet the patients still have symptoms of severe fatigue, thinning hair, and weight issues. Unfortunately, this is too common with thyroid care. The good news is we can help, and there is hope. The doctors at Integrative Health, including myself, specialize in naturally treating your thyroid, your hormone, and adrenal issues. We would love to get you started on the path to ideal health. From the comfort of your own home, you can get treatment with one of the doctors at Integrative Health via telemedicine. Go to integrativehealthcare.com to become a new patient today. Use the code PODCAST20 for 20% off your new patient visit. Again, that is integrativehealthcare.com and use the code PODCAST20, all one word. Get back to the road to thriving. We look forward to seeing you.
And here's some thoughts along that. We need to figure out what works for ourselves for sure. But, one more pitfall about that is there are things like longevity or preventing chronic disease that we can't figure out for ourselves. We get one run at it. And if we hit 70 and it turns out that, we actually have a ApoE variation, we shouldn't have done all that butter for all those years, we died early, we can't redo the experiment. So that's, so there's a lot of things we can see in the day-to-day basis, how we feel well. And there are things like that to where, I got to do my best to model and learn what we can from what others have done. And I feel the way you do about protein. I don't do well when I have less. More of our personal discussions here, kind of a fun thing to talk through, but I resonate so strongly with the ethical and the environmental arguments of veganism and, avoiding animal proteins. And I just fall flat on my face when I eat that way. And I've tried so hard. Every way you could think of, and denser, concentrated versions of plant protein. And I just can't get away without a certain amount. And have you followed the cultivated is the most recent term I've heard, the Cultivated Meat Project?
No. What is that?
It fascinates the heck out of me. They've also called it cultured meat or clean meat or lab grown. So it's basically just, cloning cells.
So actually, okay, I think I heard about this briefly. So it's basically growing meat.
It's meat grown in a dish and not on the hoof. Rather than raising a cow to get a steak, you just raise a steak. You just take actual steak cells and you put them in a photocopy machine and you press copy. And of course, it's not quite that simple, not quite that cost effective yet, but that's the basic concept. So
would they be able to modify it to have certain fatty acid profiles and things like that?
Yeah. So a couple cool ideas. That's exactly one of them. They could. And it's based upon substrates. So it's kind of like hydroponic farming where you're growing plants in an aqueous solution. They've got muscle cells. They've got them in a solution. They've got a current in there. Almost sounds Frankenstein-like, but the current actually causes them to contract a little bit. So that makes them want to grow and reproduce. And based upon what solution you give them, you could completely adjust fatty acid profiles, micronutrient profiles, amino acid profiles. The sky's the limit.
That is fascinating.
Well, and check this out. So the negatives in terms of the environmental impact, water, petroleum product usage, the humanitarian concerns, the land requirement concerns, the methane emissions, the CO2 emissions, the antibiotic overusage, the infectious disease that's spread from that, it's just gone in one fell swoop.
That's really fascinating. And what's so interesting? It's making me really aware of, I think, how ingrained our, when a new idea is presented to us, our biases. And because, so you're telling me about this meat, and my initial response is, oh no, that's not natural, So, but that's clearly that's a pre-ingrained bias that I'm having against the whole concept. But now I'm just thinking about it, and it's why, what is the problem here? And why does it have to be a morality thing of, right or wrong? And I'm just thinking about the potential. So, wow, I have to think more about this. The idea of creating a quote food that would, perfectly suit the human body without all of these environmental.
Well, and by and large, there hasn't been a lot of talk about the fact that you could change the nutrients. By and large, it's just you would copy it and have the nutrients really the same, apart from whatever macros the substrate. But I heard someone talk about having the innate reaction, because I've certainly seen that. And some have thought so if there's a meatball that came from a laboratory and it's sterile and there's people wearing white coats and stuff, and that sounds kind of scary. But if there's a meatball that came from a feedlot and animals are walking in their feces and there's death and disease and illness, I want that meatball.
That's so true. I guess my innate reaction that I'm being really aware of right now, I'm thinking, okay, like would the body know, like how would it be interpreted by the body? Like,
well, so here's the thing. So this has happened. So people, it's not commercial yet, but it's been done. It's been made. Chefs have worked with these foods. People can't tell the difference on blind taste tests. And microscopically, you can't tell the difference. So there's no genetic difference. It's the same cellular architecture. It's the same thing. Your body digests it. It's the same thing.
So could they do that with fish and remove the problems of like mercury toxicity and
completely? And that's in development too. So dairy milk is one of the easiest things to synthesize. Albumin from egg, fish is quite easy. To be really detailed, ground meat is simple, but steak requires a lot of fibrous textures and whatnot. That would be a few more steps of complexity. But yeah, it's happening.
That's fascinating.
Poultry's easy. Yeah. Total tangent, but something that I'm excited about. And
I'm definitely going to be following that because, I mean, my problem is I'm always looking at these different, food options, and I'm always like hoping to like look for the positive, but I tend to like focus in on the negative. So when I like fish, like a nice, lean, and I don't, not to bring up the whole, fat versus non-fat, that whole debate, but,
okay.
So like, a lean white protein of fish, like I actually do really well with that, but then I get nervous about like heavy metals. With, red meat, it feels very nutritious to me in a way. Like I just intuitively respond well to it, but I do have actually some concerns about the fat content, especially if paired in the context of carbs. And, like chicken, I focused in on like the polyunsaturated fat ratios. So this concept of being able to, create, I'm gonna have to keep my eyes on this. This is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a thing too, is that there's no food that you couldn't find some plausible way to be concerned about. That's a pitfall.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we've got to eat.
I know. This is so true. So true.
I'm going to forward you. I'm going to forward you some papers on a paper I've got coming out on polyunsaturated fats and linoleic acid, and it's been a fascinating thing to go pretty deep in. It's been really, really eye opening for me. Yeah,
I mean, I probably Google it. Like I'm usually on PubMed like every single night researching it, because I don't know. The studies are. I just find so much as far as how it affects metabolism, how it affects the body. Seems very complicated.
I'm going to send you a draft to look at. The general consensus that I've been seeing emerge is that there certainly are a lot of ways by which mechanistically or in murine studies that omega-6s are different or in excess. And they are really critical in arachidonic acid synthesis and leukotriene, also eicosanoid synthesis. But it's what we're seeing now is that the body's got a lot of internal regulation. And when there's high amounts of output of inflammatory compounds, it may be less about just what's coming in as a substrate and more about how it gets filtered through the system. So yeah, I'll forward that along.
Oh yeah, no, I would love to read that. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of versions of that, if someone were saying, hey, I've done various versions of caloric restriction or attempted healthy eating and they've been less effective for me, where would you say would be a good place for them to initially test? And then let's say that they've been prone to, maybe their cortisol has been an issue or they've had problems with blood sugar being regulated. Any granular ways in which you'd have them just suggest to try that out?
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like I'm going to have a very controversial perspective on this, because that is one thing that is often brought up with the fasting is its effects on things like hormones, cortisol, circadian rhythm, especially people who seem to thrive on like a later night eating window compared to an earlier day eating window. So for both myself, my co-host, we both do a later night eating window, and a lot of the listeners do that as well. But all these studies often come out showing the benefits of, early time restricted eating. So eating earlier in the day, advocating that, our hormones are more primed to, eat during the day, and that it's much better to fast during the night, or stop eating early. So it's a very complicated topic that I approach with caution. But we do see, looking at Ramadan studies, which I do find pretty applicable because they practice it does manifest often similar to the 1 meal a day type pattern, since they're not eating during the day. And actually, there are quite a few studies on like women specifically fasting in Ramadan, and it has actually very beneficial effects on their hormonal profile. So I found that really interesting. There was actually one study specifically on women with PCOS and seeing beneficial effects from that. And there have been a lot of studies as well looking at time-restricted eating on women in general with PCOS or hormonal problems and seeing beneficial effects. So, and then there was actually recently, I don't know, there was 2 studies that came out. Let me pull them up. Hold on. Did you see the 2 studies recently from 2019 that looked, I mean, it was also looking at early time-restricted feeding. One was early time-restricted feeding reduces appetite and increases fat oxidation, but does not affect energy expenditure in humans. And then the second one was, let's see, early time-restricted feeding improves 24-hour glucose levels and affects markers of the circadian clock, aging, and autophagy in humans. So this is actually, so both of these looked at early time-restricted. Yeah. So the opposite of what I just said with the late night eating, but they had really, really fascinating findings on how it affected, hold on one second, a multitude of factors as far as regulating appetite. The second follow-up study was really, really fascinating because it saw a lot of epigenetic or changes on the epigenetic level. So a lot of genes influenced with it related to lifespan were actually upregulated with this early time-restricted eating. It was really interesting to see these studies, and I'm glad they're doing more well-controlled studies that are actually looking at this. The second one, the reason I made me think of it was they actually measured cortisol response, and they found that it actually, again, this was early time-restricted feeding, but it actually had it increased cortisol in the morning and decreased it at night, which is pretty much in line with the natural cortisol rhythm. So people often say that, intermittent fasting has a negative effect on our hormones, our stress hormones, but that actually found a pretty beneficial effect, which
eating early in the day.
Yeah, which actually I thought it would have the opposite effect, like an early time window. I was thinking that it would lower cortisol in the morning and, raise it at night. But they actually found the complete opposite. The takeaway that they found from the first study was basically that people on these windows, they had lowered appetite, they burned more fat, but what they were testing was their weight loss and their fat oxidation was not because they burned
a change
more.
In metabolism, right? Their metabolism didn't change.
Yeah, and
they were eating less.
Yeah, and that actually brings up a really interesting point, because they were comparing it to rodent trials, for example. And they were saying that in rodents, and this is something that we should probably talk about, is because I think a lot of the clinical literature at the beginning on intermittent fasting was, often in rodent trials. And the question is, how applicable is that to humans?
Well, especially in terms of metabolic rate, metabolism, they're so different in terms of their food intake per their body size and their frequency of food requirements. So yeah, that's tough to extrapolate.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, this, if you think about this, and people never bring this up, but I think this is huge. So when rodents are put on fasting protocols, quote, fasting protocols and studies, they lose, if they fast for 48 hours, which granted that is a little bit more than like the ADF protocol, but 48 hours will often, that's often studied in the literature as well for humans. But rodents lose 20% of their body weight.
Right.
So
they can die in a few more days. Yeah.
Yeah. So so any study we're looking at where they did, a 2-day fast in a rodent, we can't really apply that automatically to a human, because that implies that the equivalent, a fifth of your body weight. It would take a much longer fast in a human to do that. So I think the takeaway from that is two-sided with rodent studies. If we see, these amazing beneficial effects in rodents, I think we might need to realize that it might take a little bit more in humans to achieve that. But on the flip side, I think if we see a super negative effect in a rodent on a fasting protocol, we can also say, okay, we also need to keep in mind that, it's much more extreme for the rodent as well. So it goes both ways.
It does. And this is really also akin to how drug trials work. And they do take the precautionary principle into account. They'll say that first on drug trials, they'll do animal studies just to see if there's obvious harm that emerges. And if there is, it's possible that harm may not be the same in humans, but it pretty much shuts down the trials. So yeah, there is an asymmetry between possible benefit and possible harm when we look at animal studies.
Yeah, it's such a nuance. And then also, for example, like if you're putting rodents on intermittent or fasting protocols, the rodents don't know that they're in an experiment.
Yeah.
So I know that sounds like kind of silly, but that has a lot of implications. They're probably going to be looking for food. They're going to be upregulating their energy expenditure physically looking for food compared to humans that are in a controlled situation on a fasting protocol. They're not necessarily going to have that increased energy expenditure because they're looking for, they're going to look for food. So the physical output of energy would be different. And then, even like the mindset surrounding it, I think can have actually profound implications. So, that was one thing that they were discussing in that first study, like that I was talking about, the 2019 one, was humans not experiencing increased metabolic or energy expenditure from fasting. And they were saying how different it was to control that in rodents versus humans. So,
Yeah, the general idea is that things that we learn from test tubes in mice, if they're promising, that can be worth looking at first in human trials that are trials about biomarkers. Can we see a measurable change? And then finally in actual human outcome studies. But yeah, those early preliminary studies are things that they're the good basis for future research, but yeah, they're not the good basis to make decisions or to think that we have conclusions.
Yeah. So I think we like to so often get really, really wrapped up in reading all the studies and what does this mean and all of this stuff. But I think where studies do really come into benefit is, especially with like rodent trials, maybe, and other animal trials, maybe not so much. I take it two ways. So with animal trials, I feel like it's hard to say, fasting a rodent this amount of hours leads to this amount of weight gain or weight loss, so humans should do this. Like, I don't think it translates as well that way. I do think it's more beneficial that we could see, what effect is the fasting having on their insulin? What effect is it having in genetic pathways? Because then there's a mechanism of action.
And that mechanism of action can be looked at in humans. But the other thing too is the mechanism of action. Those are still proxies that would make one want to see that maybe there is a positive outcome. There's so many times in which even a human mechanism of action is not the same as an outcome. There were so many drugs that lowered cholesterol but raised heart disease risk, for example. So yeah, the ultimate thing is if we know something actually causes a beneficial effect in humans, then we know it can cause a good effect in humans. But short of that, we really don't.
Yeah, I guess coming back to the intermittent fasting though is I feel like historically, we've seen that, and this is just me, I'm just thinking aloud right here. Historically, we've seen not eating consistently seems to correlate to health in a lot of populations. So I feel like there's a foundational basis to it that the mechanism of action might then align with or support.
Yeah, there's certainly plausible mechanisms of action. So now hopefully we'll be seeing some good ongoing clinical outcome studies to help us know if that is the case or not, and if so, how to best apply it.
Yeah. But going back to the real life applicability of these approaches, which I think is kind of how you started our conversation at the beginning. Yeah. Because here we are, looking at these studies and, what's happening on a mechanistic level or on a cellular level. But I think it's really important to take in real world experience. And I think one of the beneficial things that we can take away from human trials on fasting, regardless of the fasting approach that is utilized in the study, be it ADF, be it, a one meal a day type pattern, be it an early time restricted feeding, oftentimes the compliance rates are pretty good for fasting protocols. And the same isn't always typically said for calorie restriction. So I think that's actually a very, very, important thing to keep in mind. And that's the studies, just like real world life. I think so many people, really seem to find a fasting window that works for them. And it does allow them to finally, in the fasted state, reach a state of more metabolic flexibility, insulin regulation, and then finally getting to feel satiated and eat what they want in their eating window without feeling restricted, 24/7. So I think it turns out to be very sustainable for a lot of people. And even if everything else, even if we just threw it out the window, I think that's actually a very powerful, I don't even like using the word powerful because I'm not trying to make an argument here either way, but I think that is something to keep in mind.
For sure. There's those to where that path has been more effective for than others. And I think that's a valid thing we should keep learning more about. So yeah. So where should we point people that want to learn more about what you're up to in your work? We'll get links on here and everything. And
yeah, sure. So for all the intermittent fasting stuff, I am the co-host of the Intermittent Fasting podcast. So we answer listener Q&As there. We answer a lot of questions that are much more real life, practical, applicable. So if you have any questions, we've probably answered it somewhere on that podcast. So definitely check it out. You can also submit your own questions to it. And then I host the Melanie Avalon Biohacking podcast. And actually, Ellen, Dr. Christianson was the first guest on that podcast. Thank you. I loved that episode. It was wonderful.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much again. It was a blast.
No, thank you for that. It was great. And one of my favorite episodes. We're at I'm in the 20s. So,
wow.
We've had a lot of really great guests and a lot of really great episodes actually surrounding things we've talked about here. So like I said, we interviewed David Sinclair about, lifespan longevity. I had Seamland on about autophagy. Oh, we didn't even talk about autophagy. I had so many things we could have talked about. So people can check that out. I also have a book, What When Wine, Lose Weight and Feel Great with Paleo Style Meals, Intermittent Fasting and Wine. And I have my blog, melanieavalon.com.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed the book, a real compelling version of your story and how you came into all this. Have you got future books or what's next for you or?
Honestly, the biohacking podcast, the Melanie Avalon Biohacking podcast, it's really become probably my main focus right now.
That's great.
Because it's just wonderful to, read all the books and then finally get to interview the authors and, really pick their brains. I get to ask all these questions I have about so many things. And so, I'm really, really loving it. It's really just a wonderful avenue to learn more and explore and meet new ideas. And yeah, I'm really excited to bring you back on for your future work that I'm really excited about. I don't know if is it private?
Well, there's a thyroid book coming out.
Okay,
but I've talked to you about it a bit more. Yeah, but it feels like, I don't know. I obviously can't directly relate, but I feel like I'm in the 9th month and it's probably twins and the babies have descended and the water's broken. I'm like, I just want to get this out. And it's been working on it so long and
I
can't wait to share it.
It's so funny. I feel like, I'm impressed. Is this your 4th book?
Well, truth be told, this one would be the 6th. Or,
wow.
Yeah, there's a couple that went by the wayside. But no, this would be the 6th.
That's amazing. Wow. I just know when I wrote my first book, I was like, okay, we're gonna take a break now. So yeah, but yeah, I love your work so much. So thank you
so much, and it's been great to hang out and. Look forward to reconnecting and staying in touch.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
All right. And those of you tuning in, thanks so much for being here. And I'll see you again real soon. Take great care. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christianson here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christianson on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.